Germany, 1940. A modest farmhouse kitchen. A mother holds a folded letter in both hands, and her hands will not stop shaking. Her husband reads it over her shoulder, once, then again, as if a second reading might change what it says. Their son had been living at a state institution 300 kilometers away, admitted years earlier for a condition the family never fully understood themselves, something the doctors at the time called feeble-mindedness or epilepsy, or simply difficult. He wrote to them sometimes simple letters in a careful, practiced hand, asking about the harvest, about a dog he remembered from home, about when he might be allowed a visit. His last letter had arrived only 6 weeks earlier. He had mentioned nothing about being unwell. The letter says he died of pneumonia. It says the death was sudden, that everything possible was done, that his body has already been cremated for reasons of public health, and that an urn containing his ashes will follow under separate cover. It is signed by a doctor neither of them has ever met, at an institution they have never heard of, in a town 300 kilometers further from home than the one where their son had actually been living. The mother reads it a third time. Something about it does not sit right with her, though she could not yet tell you exactly what. Their son had never had a weak chest. He had never been sick a day in his life before he was sent away. And now, apparently, he has died somewhere else entirely, of an illness that arrived and killed him faster than a letter could reach them. She folds the page along its original crease and sets it on the table, and for a long moment neither of them says anything at all. She has no way of knowing yet that this same letter, nearly word for word, is arriving in mailboxes across the entire country. On the same weeks, addressed to different families, describing different invented illnesses, sent for the exact same reason. Before we go further, we need to be completely direct with you. This is, without question, the darkest thing this channel has ever covered, and every word of it is true. This is not a story about soldiers or battlefields, and it is not a story that unfolds in a camp behind barbed wire, the way this era of history is usually shown. It is a story about doctors, men with medical degrees, in white coats, working inside ordinary hospitals, who built and ran a killing program against their own patients. Years before the camps most people associate with this era of history had even been constructed. We are not going to show you anything graphic, but we are not going to soften what happened either, because softening it is exactly what let it happen undisturbed for as long as it did. And if you take away only one thing from what follows, let it be this: almost none of what enabled this program required anyone involved to think of themselves as a monster. It required forms, it required committees, it required people simply doing the next administrative task in front of them. To understand how that letter came to exist, we have to go back 2 years earlier, to an office in Berlin, and to a man sitting at a desk with a very tall stack of paper in front of him. Each sheet in that stack represented one patient from one institution somewhere in Germany. A name, a diagnosis, a brief medical history. A single line asking whether the patient was capable of productive work. The form had been designed to look almost administrative, the kind of paperwork any large public health system generates by the thousand. It was formally called a Meldebogen, a reporting form, and every psychiatric institution and long-term care facility in the country had been ordered to complete one for every patient in its care. Doctors and administrators filled them out believing, in many documented cases, that they were compiling routine statistics for wartime resource planning. Nothing on the form said what it was actually for. Compliance was not, in every case, purely a matter of deception. Wartime Germany was actively redirecting hospital beds, staff, and food rations toward military needs, and institutional directors were under real, constant pressure to justify every resource their long-term patients continued to consume. Some administrators appear to have understood, or at least strongly suspected, what the completed forms would eventually be used for, and filled them out regardless. A small number even volunteering unusually thorough reports, apparently believing it would ease the burden on their own overstretched wards. Others, by their own post-war testimony, genuinely believed the paperwork was administrative until patients they had reported began failing to return from transfer. The completed forms were sent to Berlin, to a small group of reviewing physicians, 3 senior psychiatrists working independently on each batch, respected men in their field with genuine academic standing, who were given no instruction to examine, interview, or even see a single one of the patients they were about to decide the fate of. Each of the 3 reviewers marked their own copy of the form separately, without conferring with the other 2, and only if a majority of the 3 marked the same patient for death did the case proceed. A split decision sent the form to a 4th, more senior physician for a final ruling. On paper, this looked like a careful, considered clinical process with built-in checks. In practice, reviewers worked from the paperwork alone, at a rate historians estimate could run to several hundred forms in a single sitting, a pace that left, at best, a minute or 2 of actual consideration behind each mark, regardless of how the procedure was formally described. A physician would read the diagnosis, note the answer about capacity for work, and mark the corner of the page with one of 3 simple symbols: a plus sign, a minus sign, a question mark for cases requiring further review. The plus sign meant the patient would be killed. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the exact hinge this entire story turns on. Not a court, not a trial, not even a conversation with the patient's own treating doctor, in most cases. A stranger in an office in Berlin deciding a human life based on a single page of handwriting at a pace that left no realistic room for careful individual judgment, even if careful individual judgment had been the actual goal. The doctors who built and staffed this system did not consider themselves to be abandoning medicine. Many had spent years working within a strand of academic thought, popular across much of the Western world at the time, and not unique to Germany, that framed certain hereditary and psychiatric conditions as a burden on the health of the population as a whole, language that dressed killing up as a kind of public hygiene, protecting a national body from what its own theorists called defective inheritance. Journal articles, university lectures, and professional conferences had spent the previous decade normalizing exactly this kind of thinking among German psychiatrists specifically, so that by the time the actual killing began, a meaningful portion of the profession had already been primed, in purely intellectual terms, to see it as regrettable but scientifically justified rather than as murder. The direct pipeline from this program into the Holocaust's extermination camps is, today, one of the most carefully documented connections in the entire history of the era, but it remains one of the least widely known outside academic circles. The villa at Tiergartenstrasse 4 itself was destroyed decades ago and now sits beneath a modern concert hall in central Berlin. A low, deliberately understated memorial installed on the pavement outside names the program and its victims for passers-by who might otherwise walk past a car park with no idea what once stood there. At several of the 6 former killing centers, memorial plaques and small museums now mark what happened on those grounds, though public awareness of the sites, even within Germany, remains considerably lower than awareness of the later camps their staff went on to help build. If you want to understand exactly how something like this gets built, one reasonable-sounding form, one committee, one bureaucratic procedure at a time, and how directly it fed into everything that followed, subscribe. This channel exists to trace precisely that machinery in medicine's darkest chapters, so you can recognize the shape of it anywhere else it appears. The program that grew out of these forms was later given a name by historians, taken from its own address, Tiergartenstrasse 4, a villa in central Berlin that served as its administrative headquarters. Aktion T4. At the time, the people running it and the doctors participating in it called it something else entirely. They called it euthanasia, a word that, stripped of everything that word is supposed to mean, was used here as a clinical-sounding cover for organized killing. The criteria for a plus mark expanded steadily as the program grew. Patients with schizophrenia, severe epilepsy, intellectual disability, long-term institutionalization of any kind, regardless of diagnosis. If a patient had been hospitalized for 5 years or more and was judged unable to work, children were not exempted, in fact. Children came first. Nearly a year before the adult program formally began, a parallel initiative had already been quietly operating against disabled infants and young children, run through a body given the deliberately bland name of the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Severe Hereditary Ailments. Midwives and doctors were required to report any newborn showing signs of significant disability. A small panel of reviewing physicians, working from those reports alone, decided which children would be sent to one of several specially designated pediatric wards, ostensibly for specialist treatment. Parents were frequently told their child was being transferred somewhere better equipped to help, in some cases actively encouraged to consent, believing they were doing right by their son or daughter. Many of the same clinical language and reporting procedures later scaled up into the adult T4 program had already been tested, refined and normalized here first, on children months earlier. Once a form came back marked with the plus sign, a second layer of deception began, and this is the part that connects directly back to that kitchen table letter. Patients selected for death were not killed at the institutions where their families knew to find them. They were transferred, moved by bus, in groups, to one of 6 specially designated killing centers set up specifically for this program: Grafeneck, Brandenburg, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Bernburg, and Hadamar, each one a former hospital, asylum, or prison repurposed and fitted with the same essential equipment. 6 sites spread deliberately across the country so that no single region's institutions would need to send patients impossibly far, and so that the flow of transports into any one location would never look unusually large from the outside. At the institutions where patients actually lived, staff were told the transfers were routine reassignments to other facilities, sometimes framed as relief for overcrowding. Patients themselves were rarely told anything beyond being informed to gather their belongings for a move. Families were rarely told about the transfer in advance and almost never told the actual destination. At the killing centers, newly arrived patients were told they were being admitted for observation or for a routine medical examination. Staff photographed and measured some arrivals, maintaining the appearance of ordinary intake procedure right up to the final steps. Patients were led into a room built to resemble a shower facility: tiled walls, sealed doors, pipes overhead, sometimes even fitted with real shower heads that were never connected to any water supply. It was not a shower. It was a sealed chamber connected to canisters of carbon monoxide gas, and the doctors and staff running these facilities used it exactly as intended, on group after group, week after week, typically between 20 and 60 people at a time. A physician was required to be present at each killing, ostensibly to certify that death had occurred correctly. Afterward, bodies were moved directly to an attached crematorium, and the ashes of dozens of unrelated patients were frequently mixed together before a portion was measured out into individual urns, meaning that whatever a grieving family eventually received back, if they received anything at all, could not honestly be called their relatives' remains in any specific sense. This is worth stating plainly because the connection is not incidental. The people who designed, built, and operated these gas chambers, the specific individuals by name in the historical record, were later transferred, along with their equipment and their operational experience, directly into the camp's history remembers as the sites of the Holocaust's mass extermination. Men who had run the gassing operations at T4 killing centers became commandants and senior staff at Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. The fake shower rooms, the falsified paperwork, the disguised bus transports, the cremation used to erase evidence, all of it was developed and rehearsed here first, against German psychiatric patients roughly a year or more before it was scaled up and turned outward. Doctors did not simply authorize this process from a distance. In many documented cases, physicians were present at the killing centers themselves, certifying arrivals as fit for the procedure, standing by during the gassing, and signing death certificates afterward with invented causes: the pneumonia, the appendicitis, the sudden cardiac failure, whichever plausible-sounding illness fit the patient's age and background convincingly enough to survive a grieving family's scrutiny. A small administrative office, staffed by clerks working from standardized reference lists, existed for the sole purpose of generating these false letters and matching each invented cause of death to a believable profile. Younger patients more often assigned sudden infections, older patients more often assigned heart failure or stroke, each cause cross-checked against the patient's actual age and known medical history, closely enough that a family reading it at their own kitchen table would have no immediate reason for suspicion. The office deliberately staggered when letters were sent relative to the actual date of death, sometimes by weeks, specifically so that a family comparing notes with a neighboring town would not notice large batches of deaths being reported on the same day. Thousands of nearly identical letters, like the one that farmhouse family received, went out this way, convincingly, week after week, for months at a time. Some doctors went further still. At several killing centers and affiliated research institutes, the brains of murdered patients were removed, preserved in labeled jars, and distributed to interested researchers for ongoing scientific study. Men building academic careers, publishing papers on rare neurological conditions, using tissue taken from people the same medical system had just killed specifically because of those conditions. One prominent neuropathologist, whose name remained attached to a recognized brain disorder for decades afterward, was known to have specifically requested that certain patients matching his research interests be selected for killing so that their tissue could be sent directly to his laboratory. Some of that preserved tissue remained in active scientific use in German research institutions for decades after the war ended, cited in published papers well into the 1980s, quietly filed alongside specimens from entirely legitimate sources, before growing public pressure from historians and disability rights advocates finally led to a formal identification, memorial service, and burial of the remaining specimens in a Munich cemetery in 1990, 45 years after the killings that produced them. That the program did not run entirely in silence. Even at the time, rumors spread quickly in the towns near the killing centers. The transport buses were painted grey and had their windows deliberately blacked out, and local residents began noticing the same buses making the same regular trips, always arriving full and always leaving empty. Children in at least one town near a killing center reportedly taunted disabled peers with cruel jokes referencing the grey buses, a detail historians have since taken as evidence of just how openly the rumors circulated, even among people who had no official information at all. Smoke and a persistent odor from the crematoria at several sites were noted by nearby residents in surviving letters and diaries. Clergy of multiple denominations wrote formal letters of complaint to regional and national authorities, several bishops raising the issue privately through church channels for months before anyone spoke publicly. Then, in the summer of 1941, a Catholic bishop named Clemens von Galen delivered a sermon in Münster that abandoned the careful, indirect language other clergy had used up to that point. He described in specific and unmistakable terms patients being deliberately killed by the state for the crime of being considered unproductive, and he named it plainly for what it was. The sermon was dangerous to deliver and dangerous to possess. Copies were secretly typed and reproduced by hand, smuggled between parishes, read aloud from other pulpits across the country, and eventually reproduced by Allied aircraft as propaganda leaflets dropped over German cities, ensuring the sermon reached an audience far beyond anyone von Galen could have addressed directly himself. Under that pressure, the centralized T4 program was officially halted within months, but officially halting a bureaucracy that had already trained hundreds of participants and normalized the entire process did not end the killing. It simply decentralized it. Individual institutions across the country continued selecting and killing patients through the remaining years of the war, through starvation diets deliberately reduced below survivable levels, sedative overdoses, and lethal injection. In a phase historians now call wild euthanasia, specifically because it lost the program's centralized paper trail. Without the Berlin office coordinating and recording every case, this later phase relied on the individual judgment of local doctors and hospital directors, some of whom killed far more patients, over a longer period than the original centralized program had assigned to their institution, which means, chillingly, that we still do not have a complete count of how many died in this later. Quite a phase, layered on top of the roughly 200,000 victims documented in the program's centralized records alone. None of this required an unusual number of monsters to function. It required, at each individual institution, a relatively small number of doctors willing to sign forms and a considerably larger number of nurses, orderlies, and administrative staff willing to carry out the daily instructions those forms produced, preparing transport lists, escorting patients to buses, adjusting meal rations, administering medication doses they had been told were standard sedatives. Post-war interviews and surviving institutional records suggest that most of this staff never personally debated the morality of what they were doing in any documented way. They followed the procedure in front of them, filled out the next form, and moved on to the next patient on the list, in exactly the same administrative rhythm as any other unremarkable task on their ward that day. After the war, A small number of the doctors and administrators, most directly responsible, stood trial, several at a dedicated Nuremberg proceeding held specifically for physicians, separate from the more widely remembered trial of camp doctors who had conducted lethal experiments on prisoners. The medical director who had overseen the entire T4 program from its Berlin headquarters was sentenced to death and executed. A handful of others received similarly severe sentences, but the reach of post-war justice stopped well short of the program's actual scale. Historians estimate that several hundred physicians, nurses, and administrators participated directly in the killings across the 6 centers and the later decentralized phase, and the overwhelming majority of them were never formally charged at all. Many returned quietly to ordinary medical practice in post-war West Germany. Some continued in academic medicine for decades, publishing research, sitting on professional boards, and in a number of documented cases, training the next generation of German physicians without their role in this program ever becoming public knowledge in their own lifetimes. One senior T4 psychiatrist, protected for years by a false identity, was only identified and brought to trial in the 1960s, 2 full decades after the killings he had helped organize. Which brings us back to that kitchen table, and to a question worth sitting with honestly. The mother in that farmhouse kept her son's letter for the rest of her life, alongside an urn she had no way of knowing contained ashes from an unmarked mass cremation rather than her own child specifically. Thousands of families received an identical fabricated story, crafted deliberately to survive exactly the kind of quiet, grieving scrutiny a mother gives a letter she reads 3 times at her own kitchen table. The system was not built to withstand a real investigation. It was built to be just convincing enough that most people wouldn't think to start one, and for years, largely, it worked. So here's the question we'd genuinely like you to sit with. Every one of those death certificates looked completely official. Signed by a real doctor, stamped by a real institution. Written in the calm, clinical language people are trained from childhood to trust without question. The families who received them were not careless, and they were not fools. They were ordinary people extended the ordinary courtesy of believing a doctor's signature meant what it was supposed to mean. That single reasonable assumption is exactly what the entire system had been engineered to exploit. What does it actually take, not in 1940s Germany specifically, but anywhere, in any system you personally trust today, for an official-looking document to become a lie no one thinks to check? Tell us what you think down in the comments.